Okay, so this is me just coming on here to read the document to you and to add a little bit more information. Don't mind how gross I look right now. Just follow along if you want someone to read it to you and give you a little bit of background information while you're following along and trying to answer the questions. So our learning target for today is I can compare and contrast the strategies used by civil rights activists such as Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X. It's asking you again to use the annotation marks, double question mark for if you don't understand, double explanation point if you do think it's an important part, an X if you thought differently, or if it's new information. Okay, so I'm going to start reading. Martin Luther King showed the gift of speech making that would soon inspire millions of people to work for racial justice. He said, "We have known humiliation, we have known abusive language, we have been plunged into the abyss of oppression, and we decided to raise up only with the weapon of protest. We must use the weapon of love. We must have compassion and understanding for those who hate us." King called on African Americans to practice nonviolence to seek justice without doing harm to others. This message won him followers among whites as well as blacks. Yet some blacks thought that King's message was too simple. Some of those who oppressed them, they believed, would have bitterly fought. Still in the years after Montgomery bus boycott, Southern blacks stressed nonviolence. One nonviolent movement started in 1960 when 4 first-year students at African American College, North Carolina, decided to sit down at a drugstore lunch counter where only whites ate. The store wouldn't serve them, but they did not leave. They came back, joined by others, day after day, to sit at the counter. Sit-ins spread to other southern cities. The sit-inners experienced violence, but they inspired more than 50,000 people, mostly blacks and some whites, to join demonstrations in 100 cities. By the end of 1960, lunch counters were open to blacks in many places. Okay, so after reading, why are you guys in this live? I'm just in here because it's easier to go live than it is to upload a video. So I'm just reading the document to then embed it into the assignment later. So I thought you guys were going to go play your game. Okay, so sorry about that, everyone else. I was just reading that section. It tells you pretty much about how Martin Luther King inspired people in a nonviolent way. And some good things came out of it. And it eventually led to African Americans being able to be served at lunch counters. It took a minute though, and some people were feeling like it could have taken a lot less time if they would have done it a little less passive and a little bit more violent. I'm ignoring your comments because I need to do this as a reading, not as a live. And I am sleepy. I'm always sleepy. I'm pregnant. Okay, so event one by one. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. Supreme Court rules separation of schools for whites and African Americans is unequal. We talked about that last week. 1955 through 56, Montgomery bus boycott. Alabama Bus Company forced to desegregate its buses. So no longer have all white buses, all black buses, or all white people in the front, all black people in the back. Freedom rides in 1961. Interstate Commerce Commission banned segregation in interstate transportation. So if you're taking a bus ride from New York to Mississippi, you would not have a segregated bus. Instead, you would be able to sit wherever you wanted. 1963, James Meredith sues University of Mississippi for admission. Supreme Court upheld James Meredith's admission to the University of Mississippi. At one point in time was an all-white institution, and now a black man was going there. So definitely some progress there. 1963, protest marches in Birmingham, Alabama. Violence against peaceful demonstrators shocked, so protest marches, but again, there's violence against those peaceful protests. It put a lot of pressure under the on Birmingham to desegregate their public facilities. So everything at that point, like, would now be desegregated. 1963, March on Washington, more than 200,000 demonstrated in support for civil rights. That's where the I Have a Dream speech comes in by Martin Luther King. In 1965, Selma March, state troopers attacked the marchers. President Johnson used federal force to protect the route from Selma to Montgomery, and thousands joined the march. In 2015, President Obama and wife led people in a march in the same location. The president stated, "Our march is not finished." It's kind of what I was talking about earlier in my live. We still need a full restoration of Voters' Rights Act, which has been weakened in some states. And if you pay attention to the news, a lot of states are getting rid of their voting booths because of the coronavirus, and they're not allowing people also to send in ballots. And so they're making people travel to go vote, and that's definitely infringing on people's voters' rights, because you're supposed to be able to vote within your own I think it's like 1 mile radius, so you can even walk to wherever your voting place is. Okay, so the question that goes with that chart: examine the chart and choose one of the major civil rights protests that occurred from 1954 to 1965. Explain why you think the one you chose was most significant or important. So in my live earlier, I talked about how I thought that the most important one was Brown versus Board of Education, because you are desegregating education. You're allowing everyone to have the same teachers. You're not, how do I explain this? Like, the more experience you have with other races in the same building, the wider your acceptance is going to be. So it's just going to create big things for the future. Like, if you don't have people separated so often, then people understand we're not so different. And I mean, it's just like kind of a aha moment when schools were desegregated. So I would say that that's the most important, most influential. My dogs are always going crazy. And I'm not going to expand on that further. I really talked about it quite a bit in my live. So if you want to go into the live from earlier today and see that, there's some answers there for you. I'm just going to keep reading. So the second article is talking about Black power. The national government had refused again and again to defend Blacks against violence. Still, the uproar about civil rights and the attention it drew around the world made Congress pass some civil rights laws, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964. These laws promised much, but were ignored or poorly enforced. Then in 1965, a stronger Voters' Rights Act made a difference in Southern voting. In 1952, only 20% of Blacks could vote, had registered to do so, but by 1968, 60% were registered, the same percentage as white voters. So as I said in my live, that's huge that now the same amount of Black people are registered to vote as white people. So it really does show that some change could happen. The federal government was trying to control an explosive situation without making any basic changes. It wanted to channel Black anger into traditional places such as voting booths and quiet meetings with official support. One meeting like that had taken place in 1963 when Martin Luther King led a huge march on Washington, D.C. The crowd thrilled to King's magnificent I Have a Dream speech. But the speech lacked the anger that many Blacks felt. John Lewis was a young SNCC leader who had been arrested and threatened many times in the fight for racial equality. Lewis wanted some meeting to express some outrage, but leaders couldn't let him criticize the national government. 2 months later, a Black militant named Malcolm X gave his view of the March on Washington. Quote, "The Negroes were out there in the streets. They were talking about how they were going to march on Washington. It was the grassroots out there in the street. It scared the white man to death, scared the white power structure in Washington, D.C. to death. This is what They did with the March on Washington. They joined it, became part of it, took it over. It became a picnic, a circus. Nothing but a circus with clowns and all. It was a takeover. They told the Negroes what time to hit town, where to stop, what signs to carry, what songs to sing, what speech could be made, and what speech they couldn't make. And they told them to get out of town by sundown. End quote. People were still exploding bombs in black churches, killing children. The new civil rights laws weren't changing the basic conditions of life for black people. Nonviolence had worked in the Southern civil rights movement, partly by turning the country's opinion against the segregationist South. But by 1965, half of all Americans lived in the North. There were deep problems in the ghettos, the poor black neighborhoods of the nation's cities. Okay, so question 2, using textual evidence, you explain in your own words what life was like for African Americans in 1965. Okay, again, in my live earlier, I talked about this, just basically that the numbers of people that were able to vote, that 60% of both black and white people registered to vote was pretty influential. But peaceful protests, if you want to focus on that more, that peaceful protests weren't doing what they needed to do, and that by 1965, people were realizing that maybe violence also needed to be brought up, just so that white people were not controlling the story. So Malcolm X, you pretty much see, he is controlling the story. He talks about how the storyline was controlled for the March on Washington, that black people didn't have as much control as they should have in their own protests, and instead they were told what to do, when to do it, and just a lot of the details weren't their own or what they would have wanted. I'm going to read the 2 documents that will help you answer your CER that's due next week. I'll be rereading these again next week for you in a separate document that I will post on Canvas so that you really understand what your assignment is for the CER. So document 1 is a quote by Martin Luther King. "We have known humiliation. We have known abusive language. We have been plunged into the abyss of oppression. And we decided to rise up only with the weapon of protest. We must use the weapon of love. We must have compassion and understanding for those who hate us." And then Malcolm X, the Negroes were out in their streets. They were talking about how they were going to march on Washington. It was the grassroots out there in the street. It was the scared white man to death, scared the white power structure in Washington to death. This is what they did with the march. Chill out. Sorry. This is what they did with the March on Washington. They joined it, became part of it, took it over. It became a picnic, a circus. Nothing but a circus with clowns and all. It was a takeover. They told the Negroes what time to hit town, where to stop, what signs to carry, and what songs to sing, what speech they could make, what speech they couldn't make. And then they told them to get out by sundown. So those are the 2 different views of how things were happening, how things were occurring. And you'll end up having to write a complete response to that prompt. And that will be next week's assignment, which I'll talk about more in next week's video. So hopefully me reading this helps you out a little bit. Again, if you're in here, it wasn't meant to be alive for you guys. I was just doing this before I forgot to do it. So this was not meant for an audience, really, like in a live type of thing where I'm answering your questions. I already did that an hour ago. Okay, so all of you that were in here, I hope this helps you answer the questions even more if you had trouble with the readings. Everyone else, I hope that this helps, and this will be embedded into the assignment for this week. Okay, thank you. Bye.